It's that time again. The annual conference of the American Society of Ag Consultants, otherwise known as ASAC, is going to be held in Fort Myers, Florida, this November 4th and 5th. Kurt Covington is one of 9 professionals who will address the conference. The other speakers who will cover a wide range of topics represent Florida Farm Bureau, Florida Citrus Commission, University of Tennessee Institute of Agriculture, National Ag Law Center, Risk Mitigators and Advisors, Tyler Associates, as well as the lead economist for dairy at CoBank, and myself, Chrissy Wozniak from North American Ag. The day and a half of presentations will be followed by ag tours on Tuesday afternoon at Echo Farms, one of my favorite places here in Fort Myers. Attendees will experience farming at its most creative, with unique demonstrations, plants, and techniques being used to help farmers and urban gardeners in developing countries. A second tour at Echo will showcase simple technologies that can improve food, water, and shelter for millions of people. A third tour of a hydroponic grower is also being planned. For more information and to register, visit www.agconsultants.org. That's www.agconsultants.org. See you there. Welcome to North American Ag Spotlight. I'm Chrissy Wozniak. I'm welcoming back one of my favorite guests who gets fired up about property rights issues and government overreach. He once worked in D.C. as a Senate staffer and has since escaped to New Harmony, Utah, where he fights for the people and the land with BlueRibbon Coalition. I heard him first on the Glenn Beck Show and reached out to him over the winter to see if he could discuss these issues here on Ag Spotlight. And I've invited him back again today to discuss the Bureau of Land Management's new conservation rule. I'd like to welcome Ben Burr. Thanks so much, Ben, for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. How have you been doing?
I've been doing good. Lots of things going on these days with ag policy. So it's busy.
Yeah, like you, I was excited to see the Sackett decision came out. And so If you're a property owner or an agricultural operator or anybody who has standing water on your property, it might be less likely that you have bureaucrats in the government that are going to come and tell you what to do or threaten you with crippling fines. And so a big win in the Supreme Court for our friends at Pacific Legal Foundation and everyone who's been cheering them along. So you brought up the BLM rule, and that's the Bureau of Land Management has proposed a rule that they're calling the Conservation and Landscape Health Rule. And this is one that will impact primarily the agricultural producers in the Western United States. If you're in a state that has a lot of BLM land, those states tend to have a lot of grazing operators, sheep and cattle. And what this rule will do is basically offer for sale conservation leases for those in the other parts of the country will recognize these more as like a conservation easement. And so some kind of a restriction on the land for a third party to come in and be a partner with the BLM in managing that land for conservation purposes. And so when I've talked to ranchers about this, I basically say you could have a group like the Western Watersheds Project, which spends all of its time and resources doing everything it can to make it difficult or impossible to operate a grazing permit on public land. Imagine if they could have a grazing lease, or if they could have a conservation lease on your grazing permit. They would use that to significantly interfere with your operation, possibly use it to put you out of business. And they would be doing that with what would now be their partners at the Bureau of Land Management. And so there's a lot to be worried about with this rule. We've been working hard to rally as many public land users as we can find to oppose this. And that's kind of why I reached out to you and why I think there needs to just be a bigger discussion about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And from the Bureau's perspective, what does conserving the land mean? Because to us, cattle on land is conserving the land.
Yeah, and that's a point I've raised in the information we've released, that most cattle operators do believe they are participating in the act of conservation, because if you don't, you'll graze off your permit to where it won't sustain cattle next year. Right. And so if you're not grazing in a way that is sustainable, your business will go out of business. And so sustainability is baked into the cake of a grazing operation, or else it simply just won't last. And so it remains to be seen. I mean, the one of the defining characteristics of this rule is how vaguely defined it is in its proposal. What does conservation mean to them? Probably, my guess is something more akin to what they see as wilderness, meaning we're not the use here that they're protecting is no use at all, and that they want areas reserved for what they call nature. This part of the BLM will just be nature. It won't be used by humans for the multiple use mandate that they have. But who knows? I mean, it could involve, maybe a grazing permit could be seen as an act of conservation. They're not signaling as much in the rule. We work with a lot of off-road recreation groups and other recreation groups with BlueRibbon Coalition, and there's a lot of great groups out there that come out and do trail maintenance. They'll restore areas that have seen heavy impact from tourism and recreation. That could arguably be seen as an act of conservation. And so if the conservation lease program is seen as an open door policy, it might not be all bad. My guess is that the organizations with the deepest pockets are the ones who will most likely end up controlling these. That will be your Natural Resource Defense Council or the Nature Conservancy, or some of these organizations just have billions and billions of dollars on their balance sheet that they could come and become the partners with the BLM on this process. And once you have a contract with the federal agency like this, they almost never change. They don't like change. Once they have something in place that they'll just find a way to make that to manage it. That all being said, even if there is a potentially redeeming path for this to be implemented, then it should be introduced as a bill in Congress, and Congress should debate it. They should decide whether this is good for the country. They can think through all the nuances, and the other members in that body can use the legislative process and the committee process and all the tools they have to make sure that a policy like this has considered all of the public interests that will be impacted. That's not what we're getting here. We're getting a rulemaking out of an agency. The statutory basis for it is thin, if non-existent, and they're just making it up, putting it out there. My guess is the attitude is they're going to just try to do it, and we can all go sue them if we don't like it. Right. And that's probably how it'll end up, but it's just the wrong way to, I think, operate our government. It's not Absolutely. What our Constitution calls for. There's a better path. And so that's why we want everybody to oppose what's going on.
Yeah, for sure. And it seems like it's just headed toward a bidding war, and a farm is a business. And if it's not making profit, why would they bid higher than billionaires? And that's a scary prospect.
Yeah, and that's kind of how we see the conservation easements work when you're going out onto the private farms and the private property and the base properties for ranching operations. Is you do have a lot of times this turns into a vanity project for people who really just have obscene amounts of wealth. Yeah. And they'll use that as a form of power and throw it around. And so those of us who care about having middle class economies in rural areas and not have them turn into just wilderness enclaves for wealthy people, this rule is going to make it really hard to be a middle class anything in rural communities and areas, especially areas with abundant public land.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And in your recent article, you wrote, in the early days of his presidency, President Biden laid out his vision to comply with the 30 by 30 agenda, which is a marketing scheme developed by hardline environmental groups to justify locking up 30% of the nation's lands and waters by 2030. So my question is, how could he have the legislative power to do any of this to start with, especially when the American people don't want it?
He
or is that the
doesn't.
Whole point?
The president does have authority to kind of lay out his vision for the executive branch of the government. And that's what he would say he was doing here. But there never was any legislative or statutory basis for the 30 by 30 agenda. But they act as if this is the operating system of the whole country right now.
Yeah.
And it's not, it's just sort of what the presidential administration, it's a way that they're articulating the values that they want to see get accomplished by their administration. And since they don't have any real congressional basis for it, they're having to re-engineer what's already on the books. And can you do that through regulatory advocacy and chicanery? Yeah, you can. And that's how they have been doing it. You've seen national monuments get designated and they'll invoke this 30 by 30 reason for doing it. Wilderness bills getting passed. And I'm kind of concerned about what might get floated into the farm bill as ways that they might try and juice up what's happening with conservation easements, because they know 30 by 30 requires some sort of sea change in how private farmland is managed and controlled and utilized, and that conservation easements are probably the most effective tool for doing that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so what they're contemplating here, and what I think is probably what they're envisioning more broadly, is let's create markets and financial instruments and things around taking land out of productive use, putting it into what they're calling conservation or no use, and building all kinds of financial incentives around doing that. And you have the New York Stock Exchange and the Rockefeller Group have developed something what they call a natural asset company, which they claim as a way of securitizing the ecosystem services of a piece of land, and that they then want to build financial markets and instruments on top of that. And they're saying they think this is a market opportunity of $4 quadrillion. And so the biggest financiers and masters of the universe are looking at how environmental policy and land use policy and all of that's functioning, and they're just seeing dollar signs as far as the eye can see.
Yeah.
And if I was somebody that owned a piece of land and my livelihood depended on my ability to effectively and productively utilize that land, I'd be getting really nervous. I would be figuring out, how do I flex my political muscles, my financial muscles, whatever I've got to protect what I have, because I think what we have is working pretty well. I mean, there's always going to be improvements you can make to any political system, but our people are fed. You can be prosperous in just about anywhere you go in this country. And to the extent that things are not working, it's usually because there's too much government intervention and not because there's too little. And so so I stand by what I said in the Salt Lake Tribune. I do think that this rule is part of the broader presidential agenda. This is how they can lock up a bunch of the BLM's public land, and everyone should be concerned about it.
Yeah, that's it. And you also stated in that article that the rule simply won't work. So what do you mean by that?
Well, the rule, again, we don't really have a very clear idea on how the rule will work. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of things that you'd have to think through with this. Those are the kinds of things. I worked in Congress for 7 years. Those are the things that Congress works out. So if you're coming into this without any backing from the congressional legislative process, there's going to be all kinds of things that you miss. My biggest concern is enforceability. I've seen case files from doing FOIA requests of public records where there are conservation groups or environmental organizations have entered into memorandum of understanding, which are legal agreements, but they're not binding. But they come into it with really high-minded goals of what they actually did was they acquired a grazing permit and said, we're not going to graze on this. We're going to manage this for conservation values. And then they violated every term and condition of the grazing permit. And then when you went and said, well, did you at least accomplish the memorandum of understanding bullet points that you agreed to do? Not a single one of those was accomplished. But because it was not a non-legally binding thing, someone like me can't come in and litigate what they did there and say, why did you enter into this? I say, well, it was non-binding, so there's really no harm done. And so to not have any enforceability baked into the cake here, if they don't comply, what are the consequences?
Right.
Those are questions for Congress, because there should be consequences. And the government has sovereign immunity. So if something goes wrong, if a partner who's operating one of these conservation leases does something that damages the property of the United States, and that's entirely likely that it'll happen. I mean, you're probably aware of like some of these high-profile grazing cases where I think it was the Hages, or I don't want to get the name wrong, but it's the ones who started a fire on their grazing property in Oregon to do a controlled burn, like using fire as a management tool. And then it got out of control and burned onto BLM land. And then they got thrown under the bus legally. They were one of the ranchers that the Trump administration pardoned. So things can go south with this stuff. If you're out there actually making changes and impacts to federal land, if you don't do it right, there's now a legal liability. Well, who is liable? Are these conservation lessees going to be covered by the immunity shields of the federal government or not? If a tribe enters into a conservation lease, you have the sovereignty issues of the tribes. I've seen cases where our government won't enforce something. Like if the tribe has agreed to do something and they don't, our federal government says, well, because of the sovereign relationship complications with that, we're not going to enforce it. So it's possible these become contracts that are unenforceable.
Right.
And so I have a lot of questions about how they'll work. The BLM has provided answers to none of this. It's just this high-minded idea they've proposed and thrown out there, and they've thought through almost none of the really complicated things that could come into play with something like this.
Right. Yeah. And you also stated that the rule could easily lead to unintended intervention into public land management by foreign governments. Explain how that could happen.
It could happen quite easily. I mean, a nonprofit conservation organization doesn't have to disclose where its funding comes from.
Right.
And so if it's funded through some sort of organization or company or entity that is an affiliate of a foreign government, we don't know if that's where it came from. And do foreign governments have an interest in whether or not America can competitively access its own natural resources? Of course they do. Do you think Russia wants America to have a really competitive and functional and productive and efficient energy industry right now? Absolutely not. If our energy market was being undermined by domestic advocacy groups, that actually is great geopolitically for Russia.
Right.
Brazil has monopolized the beef market in 50 different ways. If Brazil wanted to fund groups that go and interfere with cattle operations on public land through the acquisition of conservation leases, that'd be a great way to handicap the American domestic beef industry. And so there's nothing in this rule that would require disclosure of foreign sources of income. Mm-hmm. And we are in a geopolitical environment where we have a lot of rivals geopolitically that do want to interfere and handicap our ability to participate in these global marketplaces where China wants to command the lithium market, that they see that as a future competitor to oil, and we do too. If you look at the Biden's policy for transportation in the next 20 years. And so if we're not going to develop domestic sources of lithium, then we're beholden to China, just as we have been to Saudi Arabia and Russia and Venezuela and other countries with oil. We have lithium here. We find it, and the next thing you know, there's a weed or a flower or something growing in the area, and we can't produce it anymore because Center for Biological Diversity shows up and says no in court. And so to give one more tool to hamstring American competitiveness seems like a bad idea. I believe this is something that would get scrutinized heavily in Congress if this was a congressional proposal. We have every branch has an intelligence committee. There's foreign relations committees. They could vet this and see, are these concerns legitimate? Are there ways we can create a program like this that requires disclosure and sets limits as to how much this can get interfered with by foreign governments? Congress has the expertise and the power to do that. The Bureau of Land Management does not. Neither does the Department of Interior. And so I raised that issue because it's easy for me in Utah to get my Utah delegation fired up on this issue. Our state is 67% owned by the federal government.
Wow.
And they have introduced bills already. And we have all our members of the delegation signed on to a bill that tells the BLM to withdraw this rule. It's really hard for me to get a congressman in Kansas to care about this because they don't have an acre of BLM land in their entire state. But if they start to see that this is a way for foreign governments to interfere with our national security interests, which it is, they should care about this. And so that's why I bring that issue up. I mean, we certainly are concerned about it, but I need folks in other states to see that that is an inherent risk to this. And if this is something that you kind of have looked over and said, oh, good, that doesn't affect me because you don't have any BLM land nearby, I have bad news for you. It is going to affect you. And so we do want people taking that concern seriously. The BLM should have to answer for it. And I would love to see Congress dive in on that and start looking at hearings, start making inquiries about what's going on with that dimension.
Right. Yeah. And I would say everybody eats food off of BLM land too, right? So it does affect everybody, and if there's less land and it costs more to produce, that affects, it'll just keep affecting everyone down the chain.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen, if any, in my lifetime, we've seen better examples in the last 2 years of supply chain disruption and supply chain fragility. And I don't think policies like this are going to help that. Yeah. I think we need to be, instead of throwing 50 curveballs at a time at our people who are just trying to run a business and feed the American people and make things work, we should just get out of their way and let them sort through what are already a lot of complicated things going on in the market.
Yeah, definitely. So what's the fallout if the rule's not withdrawn? We get down the road. What are some, I guess, what would you speculate are some examples of implications for farmers and public recreation?
Okay, so first of all, I think this rule goes into effect. If they sign the decision record and put it into effect, I think it'll get challenged immediately by the number of groups I've seen coming out of the woodwork. I think it'll be like the Waters of the United States rule, where it'll be a hot potato for 10 years in the courts as they try to define that. But that means it still settles somewhere. And let's say that it does settle somewhere and it settles in favor of the BLM's position, which is that they do have the authority to do this and they're going to do it. And they actually go start selling conservation leases. It'll be a land rush. There will now all of a sudden be 247 million acres of land that's open for some kind of a conservation lease. They'll have to define what kind of entities are eligible to acquire them. And so you have to decide, am I one of those entities? And then people will go and apply for them. And then how will they decide who gets to take control of the conservation leases? It'll be all kinds of factors, but my experience with agency decision makers, they're very political animals. It'll probably be not based on something that's objective and fair. It'll probably just be a political calculation, but depending on who's in control of the administration at that time. And you'll probably see most of them get acquired fast. I don't think this is something like the Homestead Act where it plays out over 50 years. I think it plays out over 2 years and then everything's taken up. There's enough money that is floating around in the conservation NGO space where I think you'll have enough applicants and there will develop processes and you'll see all of these get spoken for. And then you'll have a 10-year dumpster fire of them trying to figure out how to work this all out because the BLM doesn't have staff to really process all of this.
Yeah.
And then you'll have organizations probably like mine that'll watch all of this and find the opportunities to come in and litigate and say, you built this on a shaky foundation and now it's not working. And so here I am to now run this through the court process again. And it'll just turn into, if there isn't already enough litigation grind and pressure on these federal agencies, that'll be, I think, the first 10 years legacy of this is just a big bonanza for the lawyers.
Yeah.
And a huge cloud of uncertainty over the producers. And to the extent there already is a lot of pressure on cattle grazing in the West, the mining interests and all of that, it'll just become exacerbated. And then as far as recreation goes, I think you'll see the highest priority conservation leases will be the places that groups have wanted to turn into congressionally designated wilderness, but have been unsuccessful at getting Congress to do it.
I see.
They'll take those acreages and say, well, we just want conservation leases on all these areas. And then they'll use that conservation lease as a tool to essentially manage that area as if it were wilderness, or launder out all the uses over time to where they can then bring it to Congress on a platter and say, this is now ready for your designation. Where right now we're all out there using it and enjoying it, and it's not really eligible for a wilderness designation. But if they use that conservation lease to restrict use and get everybody off the land, then they would, I think, be preparing it to take to Congress to permanently then restrict public access from those areas. And so we want all our users opposing this because we think that is everything we've seen out of how these agencies operate. They absolutely will use it as a tool to restrict public access for recreation on public land.
Wow. So Representative John Curtis, he's introduced HR 3997.
Yep.
Can you give us an outline of what this would do?
I don't have to give you an outline because it's one paragraph. It basically just says the Bureau of Land Management needs to withdraw the rule. This rule should not go into effect. And it's just Congress saying no.
Yeah.
And there's a companion bill was introduced actually first in the Senate by Senator Barrasso, who's the chair of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Had pretty much most of the Western state senators on there. And the bill in the House has quite a few co-sponsors. And so that's something at BlueRibbon Coalition, we're advocating our members to go contact their member of Congress. It's an action everybody can take. This is one of those bills that your member of Congress probably isn't like prioritizing if you don't live in the West. Mm-hmm. But if they heard from a few people just saying, hey, Congressman so-and-so from Mississippi, we like this and we just want you to support it, they'd look at it and say there's really not a lot of political cost to support it. There just isn't a political incentive. And so we would love for a national movement to be created around this, to where folks will go contact a member of Congress. It's really an easy ask to support a bill that's already written. It's one paragraph. It's simple. You don't have to spend hours studying it. Even if you don't have much of a dog in the fight over public land management, if you care about administrative state abuse of power, you should support this. If you care about federalism, you should support this. If you care about constitutionally limited government, supporting this is right in your wheelhouse. And so there's all the reasons in the world for a substantial number of Congress to add their support to this. And we would love to see the bills that are out there get fully co-sponsored by as many people as possible. That would send a strong signal to the BLM that they're going down a dangerous path, that they might put a lot of time and effort into this rule only to have Congress overturn it the second they have the political capital to do it. We also have an action alert where people can just go comment directly to the BLM, share their thoughts about it, which that needs to happen. There's a comment period now that ends on June 20th. Okay. And so they have time to go add their own voice to this planning process that's being run through the Federal Register. It's an open public comment period. And then in addition to that, we have a group letter where we've identified the 4 principles I outlined in that opinion editorial you've been reading from that was published in the Salt Lake Tribune, and just say, if you agree with us on these common shared principles, the worry about foreign intervention, the worry about the BLM exceeding its statutory authority, like all these things that I think should unite everybody. Yeah. We do want groups and organizations and institutions to go make their own separate comments. But our thought was, let's at least get a rule or a letter that everybody signs on to, so that that's a tool we can use to go to the holdouts in Congress to say, we notice your name's not on this legislation. We signed this letter we already have 85 signatories. Let's say we had 500, groups all across the nation that are worried about this. We think there's a lot of reasons you should support it. It just lets them see that we've built a strong coalition. So if you're part of a Farm Bureau or a Stockman's Association, a Water Users Association, like anything that sort of has institutional credibility, we're reaching out to like 4-wheel drive clubs and ATV clubs and motorcycle clubs. Like we just want them. I have cattle ranchers that are all signing on their operations onto this, and we just want to have one place where we can say everybody's with us on this. And so if you have listeners that kind of fall in that boat, We have withdrawtherule.com is a website we've created where you can come find these actions you can take. And if you want to add your group to that letter, it's just a quick form of your name and email address and contact information so that we can confirm everything with you and keep you updated on any progress or any new information that comes out about this.
Yeah, that's perfect. And we've already signed up, put North American Ag on the list too. So
I saw you.
I can verify that it's pretty easy.
Yeah, and pretty straightforward. And I think the unifying principles are pretty straightforward, and most groups should agree with them. And we've seen a lot of groups like the Safari International came out with their concerns about hunting, and we want them to do that. We want them to get their concerns out there too. Yeah. But we think they could look at our letter and say, yeah, we agree with those 4 common reasons as well. Mm-hmm. And that's the way we want people to approach that.
Right. Yeah. So all of the links will be in the show notes. So it's where you can find them, go directly there, sign up your organization. And yeah, let's do something, take some action here.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a big one, and it'll be one that hopefully they withdraw the rule. But if not, the same news that broke about the second rule will be there in a couple of years with the Supreme Court on this one too.
Can we not just save all that time and effort?
Yeah, let's just do it the right way this time. I mean, this court has shown it doesn't really have much of an appetite for this kind of nonsense anymore. Yeah. And so I think the agencies are they're doing what they've been conditioned to do for the last 30 years, but rules are changing and we've got to be part of that change. We did end up with I think one of the best Supreme Courts in my lifetime, and they'll be influencing these things for years to come, but we, the people, have to play a role in that. And this is how you do it.
Yeah. We all have a responsibility to have our say in it too. So where can people find more information about Blue Ribbon Coalition as well?
Yeah. So our website, so our website is sharetrails.org. Mm-hmm. But if you went and took action on withdrawtherule.com, we would see you as someone who cares about our issues, and that we could stay in touch with you through our action alert newsletters and things like that. Because we participated in over 300 federal actions last year. And so there's a good chance we're involved in something you care about, and we'd love to have your support in all of that.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your service, what you do, and for taking time out to talk about this.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on again, and let us know when the show's out there, and we'll promote it to our followers and listeners and make sure everybody's getting this information.
Awesome. And thanks to all who are watching or listening. If you want to learn more, the links are provided in the show notes. Don't forget to subscribe to North American Ag Spotlight on YouTube, Rumble, or Telegram channels. And the podcast is available on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, Amazon, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you like the episode, I'd love it if you shared it, and have a great day. Our newest podcast by North American Ag is called What Color is Your Tractor? The stories behind the ag brands you love and the ag brands you love to hate. Hosted by me, Chrissy Wozniak. We take a deep dive into the companies that have built modern agriculture. Subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform. Go to whatcolorisyourtractor.com. Available on Apple, Amazon, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts.